back and in living color. Hold on. Hold your horses. Just making sure my mic is up to snuff. We are back and in color, and we are going to finish up the thing. I feel so bright. I feel so colorful. And also so, like, my background is so drab. Okay, so where did that leave us? Well, thank you all for enduring that small break. We're going to pick up about where we left off. I want to just make that big. Is it that one? Nope, not that one. Is it that one? Nope, not that one. It's that one. Cool. All right, just playing with my settings here a little bit. Let me make sure that the volume is good. And we are going to watch what he said next. So before we left, we were talking about the Socratic method. I was introducing the figure of Socrates via Vervaeke so that we could get a better understanding of, maybe a more interesting understanding of how the method is, the Socratic method is typically taught. So I wanted to examine just another part of this video. This is the second episode of his After Socrates series, which is the new series. The old series was Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, also very decent, pretty good. So we're watching the second season, or the second episode of After Socrates, just a part of it. After we watch this little segment on learned ignorance, we're gonna expand the scope a bit into some other perspectives on what's going on, and hopefully, like, you can catch a bit of Vervaeke presenting this in a interesting way. There are some other videos on this that I'll probably review in the future, but maybe before we get back into it, I want to express some of my intention here. Critical thinking. It's a good idea. In a world of misinformation, it's good to have some basic critical thinking skills to be able to delineate, to categorize, to see with clarity the bullshit, trademark, that surrounds us. So we're going to watch some Vervaeke. So my intention with some of what I'm going to do is about getting into seeing things a little more clearly, and that in fact there's more to it. There's more to it than just critical thinking. In fact, there's experiential aspects. There's ways in which we must develop our perspective such that we can not only discern, but we can develop and grow. In fact, a part of discernment has to be based in how we are as people. So if that made any sense, great. If it didn't make sense, don't worry about it. Hopefully I can make myself more clear as time goes on. I get better at this whole friggin' thing, you know? Okay, so we are starting this puppy back up now.
He has cultivated, and this is going to become an important phrase, he has learned ignorance. In fact, when I say learned ignorance, I want you to hear both pronunciations, learned and learned. He has learned ignorance. He has become aware of his ignorance in a way that makes a huge difference to specific, actual, concrete situations. So let's explore the dynamics of this a little bit better. So we have, on one pole, we have conversation. Socrates is engaging in a conversation. I want you to start to get a feel for this. I want you to think.
Okay, so prior to this, we watched a little clip, and maybe just for the sake of, because this is a different video, maybe I'll just toss it up real quick. Prior to this, we'd watched an earlier part of this clip about where was it? It was basically covered. I want to pull it up. Let me just pop that off real quick. It was about how Socrates, that the fact that people say that what Socrates knew is that he knew nothing, that was the only thing he knew. And I want to just iterate here a point, because part of this whole episode, the idea behind this whole episode, is the fact that Socrates knew a bunch of other things as well. Now, we're not going to cover that right now, but I want to just present the argument, or at least so that you present it so that you can hear it from the horse's mouth, as it were. That is Vervaeke, not Socrates. But present it so that you can see that sort of where I'm getting my idea from, citing my source visually, if you will. So we're just going to pop that puppy back on the screen. There is John Vervaeke's beautiful face. And this is where he makes that point. And we are starting right now.
That all he knows is that he does not know. That's actually not accurate. Many people put that, all that Socrates ever said is that he knew that he, no, Socrates doesn't say that. He said that's what his wisdom consists in. Socrates actually claims to know a bunch of things.
Okay, so he said that's where his wisdom is. It's not the only thing he knows is that he does not know. It says that's where his wisdom is. That is, he is wise. The reason that the oracle at Delphi claims that he is the most wise is because he knows that he does not know. And he's going to elaborate on this. Why don't we just watch a bit more, and then we'll move on to the next thing. But I just want to give you a flavor for it. If you want, you can watch this video on his channel. We're going to just watch just a tad bit more.
So first of all, we have to modify it. But then we'll come back to your point, because you are making a good point in posing that problem. What does Socrates claim to know? Well, he famously claims to know ta erotica.
Nice.
He knows about the erotic things. That doesn't mean he's really good in bed or he just knows about sex. He's talking about eros in a much more comprehensive sense, about how we seek to bind ourselves to things. And this seems inherent to us. We seem by nature to be looking for things other than ourselves to complete us. And notice how that gets us into self-transcendence. I'm looking for something that's other than me to become me, so that I am more than me, but completed as me. And as soon as you think about this, you start to go, oh, how does that make sense? Hold on to that vertigo. We're going to come back to it.
Okay, that's where I'm going to stop that thing right there. Okay, so that's a good point, I think, to transition to Agnes Callard, actually. So Agnes Callard, if you don't know, she wrote a book. Agnes Callard wrote a book called Aspiration that was kind of a response to L.A. Paul's book called Transformative Experiences. Transformative Experiences. Was it Transformative Experience? I think it was Transformative, but hold on, I have it in my little Kindle app. Please bear with me as I examine the oracle at cell phone. So aspiration, transformative experience. Excuse me, L.A. Paul. My understanding of the argument approximately is basically L.A. Paul says there are experiences that we can't possibly logically know, reason our way through in terms of like what it would be like. So she gives the analogy of a vampire. How do you know whether or not you want to be a vampire? You can't just trust people who've already turned to be vampires because they've lost something of their humanity, and yet you can't trust anyone who is a human to say don't become a vampire because they have no idea of what that would be like. The truth is that we have to figure out this on our own. She then goes on to say that although it's ridiculous to talk about being a vampire, we actually face these situations in our life all the time, such as becoming a parent. And what do we do when we want to become a parent? Hold on, I may be. Well, how do we decide that we want to become a parent? So, aspiration is Agnes Callard's sort of response to that idea, which I think this is from her work, which is basically that we do have things that we do to sort of prepare us for transformative experiences. One thing that we do is we will play at the boundary of the thing we're trying to do. So like in wanting to become a parent, we might do something like get a dog. We with our co-parent will get a dog and try and get a sense that isn't actually having a child. We'll try to get a sense. We'll play with the boundary of what it might be like to try and get a flavor of that parenthood piece. So that's who Agnes Callard is. Vervaeke relies on some of her work for some of his argument, particularly that book. So that's who we're turning to now. She is going to tell us a little bit about the Socratic method. It'll be interesting to see what she has to say in contrast to how Vervaeke has presented the figure of Socrates. And who she is, she's a professor at the also a professor at the University of Chicago. At least last time I checked. So feel free to look her up. We're gonna see what she has to say about this subject right now.
So, I think there was a single thing that Socrates came up with that is kind of like his core contribution to philosophy, and it's his method. So there's a lot of controversy in the literature about whether Socrates even has a method, and if so, what is it, right? So I think he does have a method. But let me state first, like, the problem of the method is a solution too, okay? And I'm going to state it really anachronistically using William James's The Will to Believe, because I think that's actually the best statement of the problem.
Okay, I'm just pausing it right there to point out, okay, William James. I've never read The Will to Believe, but William James, if you're unfamiliar, was one of I think he was the first officially titled psychologist in the U.S. He was at Harvard. He wrote another book that's very influential called The Varieties of Religious Experiences. He was very speculative in terms of what he expounded on. He was, I think, tangentially related to the pragmatist movement in, John Dewey and the likes of them. And so that's the William James that I believe she's talking about. So given that, let's just do a little pop back and we're going to see.
William James is The Will to Believe, because I think that's actually the best statement of the problem that Socrates solved several thousand years earlier. So the problem is that if we want to know, if we want to have knowledge, or we're in the project, in the business of coming to know, then it looks like we have to believe truths, right? And we have to avoid believing falsehoods. And a lot of people throughout history have thought those were somehow the same, very same project. what James argues, I think, really persuasively is not only they're not the same, they're actually incompatible. So here's an example. Suppose that you're doubtful about some proposition. I mean, you think it's probably true. Like, you think, does the external world exist or something, right? And you think, like I'm almost sure it does, right? Should you believe that it exists or not? You might think, well, look, suppose your goal is to have some truths. Then you should believe that it exists, because you don't have any hope for having a truth unless you believe one way or the other, and you think it's more likely that it exists, so you should just go with that. But suppose that what you're committed to above all is avoiding falsehood. Well, then you should suspend judgment. It looks like insofar as you're committed to avoiding falsehood, like you should kind of almost always suspend judgment, right? And so James, in The Will to Believe, engages with Clifford as the representative of that view. Always suspend judgment, right? Because, otherwise you might end up believing a lie, right? And that would be the worst thing ever. And James is like, that's not the worst thing ever. Telling somebody never to believe anything because they have some risk of believing a falsehood is like telling a general never to send his soldiers into battle because they might get a scratch. Right? He's like, you gotta take some risks in life. Okay. But what I think James is really good on is the idea that these two rules, have truths, believe truths, and avoid falsehoods, are in tension with one another. And insofar as you're like totally committed to the one, to having truths, like, well, you should just guess with respect to everything, like have some belief about everything, right? Because, that's how you can have a truth about that, right? But insofar as you care about like avoiding falsehoods at all costs, we'll just suspend judgment about everything, right? So they tell you to do opposite things, so they're not actually compatible. Which is, to me, like super revolutionary when I really faced up to that, because I'd always thought those were just kind of two ways.
All right, so if we were to examine this from a Vervaekian lens, he would say they're actually agree that they are in tension with each other, but it's not an unproductive tension, right? She's saying that the Socratic method is that these two lines, avoid falsehoods and believe truths, that there might be some way you can do both. And that in order to approximate something like a truth, you may have to do both, and they are, in fact, opposites. So Vervaeke might use the language tonos, which is jargon for, like, tension, but a tension that, like, refines and builds and zeroes in. And he would probably relate that to the idea from Merleau-Ponty of optimal grip. So you're trying to like get a full grasp of the idea, and you sort of are fiddling with it until finally you find a resting place of relationship to the idea such that it then settles in your mind. That would be sort of the Vervaekian way of looking at what she's saying. So let's see what else she says.
The same thing, right? Now, what does James think you should do? Well, he doesn't agree with Clifford. Clifford thinks always prioritize the rule to avoid falsehoods, right? The thing that I think James thinks Clifford gets is you gotta prioritize one way or the other because they're not compatible, right? But what James thinks is, well, it's contextual. So sometimes prioritize the one rule, sometimes prioritize the other. It's going to depend. A lot of practical or action-based context, you're going to have to prioritize the rule to have some truth in order to have something to act on. So that's James's solution, is like balance it out and, some circumstances prioritize the one, some circumstances prioritize the other. That's not a good solution because you'll never have knowledge unless you're following both rules. That is, yeah, these rules might tell you to do opposite things, but you need to follow both of them in order to have knowledge. Because if you've acquired a truth but you haven't followed the rule avoid falsehood, then you don't know that thing. Even if it's true, you don't know it, right? And so both of the rules, if they're followed individually, lead you to not having knowledge. In one case, because you won't have any beliefs. In the other case, because knowledge entails knowing that you know, and that entails avoiding error, and that entails following the negative rules of all the positive ones. Okay, so we have a predicament, right? In order to have knowledge, you have to follow both rules, but James shows you can't follow both rules. I think Socrates' method is a solution to that, which is, his thought is that you can follow both rules if you have two people, and one of them is following one of the rules, and the other is following the other rule, and they're doing it cooperatively, right? So what you have is an adversarial division of labor, kind of like what you have in a courtroom when.
Okay, this is going to be interesting when we get to the Nolanda debate thing. And so, like, part of what I want to do in this stream here is to draw out the comparison between Nolanda debate and the Socratic method. And there's primarily more information on the Socratic method than there is on Nolanda debate. We're going to start with the Socratic method, as I've already, we've started. And then we're going to move to Nolanda debate. I'll talk a little bit more about what my experience has been like. So I think it's interesting that she put it that way, because she's saying that you can follow both rules if you have two people, and you can have a division of labor if you have more than one person. I think that's remember that that's gonna play a role later. So remember that.
And I'm the prosecution and you're the defense attorney, and my job is to make the case for the guilt of the person, and your job is to make the case for their innocence. Like, we both care about justice. We both want justice to be done, right? But justice has in it these two subordinate goals of convicting the guilty and acquitting the innocent, and they pull against one another. Like, if you're totally committed to convicting every guilty person, like, no matter what, right? Like, you should just convict everyone, right? But then you're not going to acquit the innocent. If you're totally committed to acquitting every innocent person, if there's even the tiniest shred of doubt, well, then you're just not going to convict anyone. And so we give those jobs to two different people, and we say, you do this one and you do this one, and we're pursuing justice together, right? Because we're both doing a part of it. So I think that Socrates came up with that as a kind of solution to James's problem, but not in the area of criminal justice, but in the area of epistemology, essentially. So it's an adversarial division of epistemic labor. That's what I think the Socratic method is. So that's kind of like the core idea, I think, of the book, is that conception of the Socratic method in the early Socratic dialogues.
Whoa, that's a lot of stuff. Whoa. Okay, let me just pop that off the screen. Okay, so you get all that? Good. That was interesting take. So she is reducing the Socratic method to strictly, it seems, or she's limiting what she's saying about the Socratic dialogues and the Socratic method to simply the realm of epistemology. That's all she's really referring to it as. Whereas Vervaeke is using it more as like personal transformation. But Agnes Callard isn't outside of that realm. It's just not at the moment. We're going to watch a couple more videos about the Socratic method because I think it's useful to gain multiple perspectives on a thing before we advance. So the next thing we're going to watch is an interview with Ward Farnsworth. Ward Farnsworth wrote a book, I believe it's called The Socratic Method, a Guidebook, or a Practitioner's Handbook. I believe that's the name of it, Ward Farnsworth. So this is the longest interview I could find with him. It's about 16 minutes. We might watch the whole thing. And I'll make some commentary. So this is a guy who wrote a textbook, a pretty decent sized textbooks. Actually, before that, I want to watch Carneades.org's video on the Elenchus. Now, the Elenchus is often referred to. The Elenchus is often what is considered to be the Socratic method. There is some debate about that. But in this particular video, Carneades is going to basically affirm that position, that the Elenchus is the Socratic method. And this is like a 6-minute video that we will watch to get his perspective. Bam, there he is. All right.
Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Ancient Arguments. In this series, we're looking at some of the ancient methodologies that the ancient Greeks used to form their arguments and how those influenced philosophy. In this video, we're checking out what is the Elenchus. Now, This is probably the best known of the three methods. The Elenchus, or also known as the Socratic method, is a method used by Socrates throughout Plato's dialogues. According to the story, the Oracle of Delphi told Socrates that he was the wisest man in Athens. Socrates was confused by this, since he claimed to know nothing. Therefore, he set out in search of someone that knew more than he did. He went around questioning various...
Okay. Now remember, he claimed to know nothing. He didn't claim to know nothing. He said that where his wisdom was knowing nothing. Now, I'm not the best person for understanding where these citations come from. I do have some work by Plato, but you know what? I'm gonna actually try and figure this out right now. I think this is an important piece. So, what dialogue does Socrates claim that he knows nothing? It's in the Meno. I know that I know nothing. Wikipedia. Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to read a bit about the Wikipedia article of this phrase because I do think it's important. Okay, so we're just going to pop this puppy down so we can focus on the whole thing. And we're just going to read it. We're just going to read this thing out. I know that I know nothing. I know that I know nothing is a saying derived from Plato's account of the Greek philosopher Socrates. For I was conscious that I knew practically nothing. Plato Apology 22D, translated by Harold North Fowler, 1966. Socrates himself was never recorded as having said this phrase, and scholars generally agree that Socrates only ever asserted that he believed that he knew nothing. Having never claimed that he knew nothing, it is also having never claimed that he knew nothing, it is also sometimes called the Socratic paradox. Although the name is often instead used to refer to other seemingly paradoxical claims made by Socrates in Plato's dialogues, most notably Socratic intellectualism and the Socratic fallacy. So if we pull this up, it says, moral intellectualism or ethical intellectualism is a view in metaethics according to which genuine moral knowledge must take the form of arrived at discursive moral judgments about what one should do. One way of understanding this is that doing what is right is a reflection of what blah blah blah. Can't really see. Socratic fallacy is the definist fallacy is a logical fallacy identified by William Furcana in 1939 that involves the definition of one property in the terms of another. Whatever that means. Okay. This saying is also connected to or conflated with the answer to a question Socrates, according to Xenophon, or Chaerephon, according to Plato, is said to have posed to the Pythia, the oracle of Delphi, in which the oracle stated something to the effect of Socrates is the wisest person in Athens. Socrates, believing the oracle but also completely convinced that he knew nothing, was said to have concluded that nobody knew anything and that he was only wiser than others because he was the only person who recognized his own ignorance. The phrase originated from Latin, can't read Latin, is possible. Paraphrase of the Greek text is quoted, blah, 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 blah. It was later back translated, blah, 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 blah. This is technically a shorter paraphrasing of Socrates' statement, I neither know nor think I know, in Plato Apology 21d. The paraphrase saying, though widely attributed to Plato's Socrates in both ancient and modern times, actually occurs nowhere in Plato's work in precisely the form I know nothing. Two prominent Plato scholars having recently argued that the claim should not be attributed to Plato's Socrates. And then that link is Fine argues that it is better not to attribute it to him. Does Socrates claim to know he knows nothing? Oxford Studies in Ancient Philosophy, Volume 35, 2008, CCW. Taylor has argued that the paradoxical formulation is a clear misreading of Plato. Interesting. So, evidence that Socrates does not actually claim to know nothing can be found at Apology 29b through c, where he claims twice to know something. See also Apology 29d. If you're familiar, I guess ancient texts often use this like number and letter system so that they can be corroborated across different translations. So that's what that's about. But where Socrates indicates that he is so confident in his claim of knowledge at 29b through c that he is willing to die for it. That said, in the Apology, Plato relates that Socrates accounts of his seeming wiser than any other person because he does not imagine that he knows what he does not know. And then the translation, I seem then, in just this little thing, to be wiser than this man at any rate, that what I do not know, I do not think I know either. From the Hedrick Carey Literal Translation, 1897. A more commonly used translation puts it, although I do not suppose that either of us know anything really beautiful and good, I am better off than he is, for he knows nothing and thinks he knows. I neither know nor think I know. From the Benjamin Jowett translation. Regardless, the context in which this passage occurs is the same, independently of any specific translation. That is, Socrates, having gone to a wise man, and having discussed with him, withdraws and thinks the above to himself. Socrates, since he denied any kind of knowledge, then tried to find someone wiser than himself among politicians, poets, and craftsmen. It appeared that politicians claimed wisdom without knowledge, poets could teach people with their words but did not know their meaning, and craftsmen could claim knowledge only in specific and narrow fields. The interpretation of the oracle's answer might be Socrates' awareness of his own ignorance. Think back to what we watched Vervaeke talk about. Socrates also deals with this phrase in Plato's dialogue Meno, where he says, "So now I do not know what virtue is. Perhaps you knew before you contacted me, but now you are certainly like one who does not know." Here Socrates aims at the change of Meno's opinion, who was a firm believer in his own opinion and whose claim to knowledge Socrates had disproved. Anyway, we don't have to finish this up at this exact juncture, but I felt somewhat obligated to read through some of that so that we could examine it in terms of examine that particular piece that's out in the world, and maybe I can disperse some more nuance in terms of how that should and can be interpreted when people say, well, Socrates only claimed that he only ever claimed to knowledge was that he knew nothing. Hopefully we've enriched ourselves with a little bit more depth, and with that we are going to continue with the Carneades bit where we left off.
Purported wise men throughout society, politicians, poets, etc. However, he would inevitably discover that they did not know what
he misspoke.
They claimed to know. And therefore Socrates eventually realized that he was the wisest man, not because he knew more than these other people, but because he understood that he didn't know anything at all.
Now, once again, he just said he didn't know anything at all, which is kind of true, but also kind of not true. So just bear that in mind listening forward.
Socrates challenged each of these different wise people's arguments using the following method. Basically, he would take the claim that a person averred that they knew, call that claim A. So that's some statement like, this is what good is, this is what justice is, this is what whatever philosophical concept of the day we're talking about is. Then he'd speak to the person and discover that in fact they believed other propositions, call them B, C, and D. And these were commonly accepted propositions. These were generally very...
Now notice another thing he's doing is restricting the knowing to the propositional. And if you're familiar with Vervaeke's demarcation of knowledge, he talks about 4 different fields. He talks about propositional, procedural, perspectival, and participatory. And he relates them to each other so that one rests on the other, rests on the other, rests on the other. And there are videos about that in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. You can probably find them. I might link them in the description, but probably not. But it's important to point out that most academic philosophers are not going to relate Socrates to any kind of existential thing. They're going to be basically analyzing propositions, which is maybe a limitation to what the work can actually do. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but the standard is to read Plato, if you're a philosopher, in terms of just the propositions. Okay.
Intuitive propositions that you would have no reason to deny. Finally, Socrates would then show through the magic of philosophy that B, C, and D actually implied that A was not the case, therefore showing that the person did not in fact know what they claimed to know. And this process of taking a claim and then finding other beliefs that that person has which contradict that claim is the Elenchic method, or the Socratic method. A prime example of this is in Euthyphro, one of Plato's most famous dialogues. You can find them throughout the dialogues, but this is commonly one of the best known. Euthyphro claims that A, good, or piety in the case of this, but good for now, is what is dear to the gods. Socrates shows that Euthyphro thinks both that B, the gods disagree about things, and C, what is good, can't also be bad. And therefore, because some gods think one thing is good and other gods think that thing is bad, and individual things can't be good and bad, things that are objectively good can't just be down to what the gods believe. He goes on to show that, so Euthyphro will change his mind. He'll say, oh, this is really what I mean, and Socrates will run the same argument over and over again. And with some little banter in between and some explanations of positions, that's most of what a lot of the Socratic dialogues are, using this method to show that people don't actually believe the things that they claim to believe, or their knowledge isn't as solid as they once thought it was. Although dialogues have fallen out of fashion in philosophical writing, this method, or showing that an opponent's claim and assumptions lead to a contradiction, is a common method used in philosophy. Or at least the argument that, well, you think that A, here's some ridiculous conclusion of A, if we logically draw out what can we conclude based on A, just using the rules of logic, you wouldn't assent to that ridiculous conclusion, you would deny that, so you have to deny A. These methods also exist to a certain degree in modern education. Some teachers ask questions of their students instead of telling them information to help them come to conclusions on their own and understand the reasoning for these conclusions. It's done both with content and around behavior, in the sense of you wouldn't want to get punched in the face, so why would you think that it's good to punch someone else in the face, showing that maybe kids' actions are contradictory with the beliefs that they hold. Socratic seminar in particular is one specific method that teachers use, which use kind of this questioning method in order to analyze a text. This is a change from some other education methods which are around students just rote memorizing information and not practicing skills so much as practicing just memorize particular chunks of information.
So in Vervaekean language, what he just said is could be categorized as practicing procedures as opposed to practicing propositions, that is, becoming aware of propositions. So the procedures of thinking and coming to right conclusions.
That was the Elenchic method. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at the Maieutic method, which some people
Okay, so that's that one. Now, I want to take a bit of a side route because I think at this juncture, what might be good is a pit stop into Aporia. So what I want is to find someone who talks about it. I think if we could find Vervaeke talking about it, that would be great. Just something short. Come on, buddy. Hold on. Okay, well, that's 23 minutes long. Ooh, new stuff. Not bad. Okay. We've got new Vervaeke material coming out. We might walk over there after we read some of this stuff. Vervaeke Aporia. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is just look up Aporia. Not a band. Man, I really thought I would be able to find just a short little blurb about what Aporia is. I don't know what a practiced life is. They're a very small channel. I don't know what this is going to be like, but maybe we can get them some views and see what it is they're talking about. So maybe this will be a good explanation, maybe not.
Music, poetry.
Oh, what a voice.
Please do, if you haven't yet, check out my website. And we were listening about Socrates. There's a word I want to talk about. It's a word I heard a few years ago and then couldn't quite remember it, which I think is appropriate. You'll see as we get through the topic. I was listening several years ago to some podcast on Greek philosophy, and we were listening about Socrates.
Socrates.
And the word that was used that stuck was the word aporia.
Aporia.
A-P-O-R-I-A. Aporia. And aporia is the word that defines the feeling
flame
of having just finished a conversation with Socrates. It may be more generally applicable, but it is particularly used to refer to the conclusion of a Socratic conversation. The actual conversation, right? Not the survive. The one-on-one person and Socrates and I. Who's been talking to Socrates has no fucking idea what's going on.
Whoa!
In fact, that is probably as good a definition of aporia as you're going to get to. What the fuck was that?
Okay. You heard that. Basically, sorry for the barking going if you can hear that. Okay, I don't know if that was really helpful. Basically, aporia is this idea of being so befuddled, having been decimated by what you thought you knew, and yet finding the contradictions in your own perspective, being so befuddled by that it's basically like a giant, huh? It's like a confusion. It's a confusion that demands, that compels you to change because you were so wrong about a thing you held so close. That's the best way I can describe aporia or aporia. Um, and yeah. So, now we're going to go on to that, what I mentioned before about the guy with the Socratic method. His name is Ward Farnsworth. This is where we're going to go next. We can examine how he talks about the Socratic method. So my hope is, and man, I've probably said this a bunch of times on this stream, but my hope is by laying all of these things out side by side, one, I can get a better understanding of sort of how different people think about it, and also maybe you can get some of that too, and also maybe we can develop better meaning making and discernment tools. Okay, so let's plow right into the next thing.
The Socratic Method, a practitioner's handbook. It's so great to have you on today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, David. Good to be here.
So I talk about the Socratic Method with my audience frequently, and I think maybe the best place to start would be when we say Socratic, there's in that word we're talking about Socrates. So maybe we can start with the origins of why this is a method attributed to Socrates and what it is.
Sure. Well, when people talk about the Socratic method in Socrates, what they usually mean is the style of dialogue and discourse and thinking that you see displayed by Socrates in the dialogues of Plato. We don't really know much about the real Socrates, whether that's how he talked. We know that's how the literary Socrates talked, and that's the model for the Socratic method.
And the model is characterized by questions, but particular types of questions meant to elicit certain type of thinking. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the Socratic method is the greatest tool there is for critical thinking and for testing people's views. It has a lot of features and they're hard to summarize quickly, but usually what Socrates is trying to do is work with the beliefs of the person he's talking to. So Socrates doesn't usually...
Okay, so here we see something that is pointed out here that maybe would not have been highlighted in the other videos that we saw. It's the idea that you're working with the beliefs that the person has. So you're taking the raw material that you're working with is that person's thoughts about a thing. Yeah, so I think that's an important thing to point out.
Say you're wrong. He says, can we agree on this? Can we agree on that? Well, but if we agree on those things, then what about this other thing that you said? It seems like there's a tension there or an issue. So he basically talks people into contradiction with themselves, which is, to me, a distinctly effective way of working with people you don't agree with.
One of the things that sometimes is frustrating in the modern landscape is you might get someone to contradict themselves, but they seem unable to recognize that they've contradicted themselves. And so, for example, we see this frequently when I will talk to people who say that Trump is actually the president and it's Joe Biden's fault that gas prices are high. And it's like, well, if Joe Biden's not really the president, how could it be his fault that gas prices are high? That's sort of the contradiction. But sometimes people seem to lack an ability to even understand the contradiction. How would the Socratic method address that?
Well, first of all, if they don't think there's a contradiction, then, and I'm the one using the method, then my feeling is that's on me. My questions have not been skillful enough, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there isn't a contradiction. They don't think there is one because it looks like there's one to you, But what they mean when they say Donald Trump's really president isn't what you think they mean. They mean this, and you think they mean that. And so there's something additional about their meaning that you've got to get to the bottom of. I just think the right way to think about this is always ask whether, if you're not making headway, it's really on them. Take responsibility and see if you can be more empathetic and try to understand what they mean or what they're thinking. That's an important part of the Socratic method is you're trying to get people to come around to your way of thinking. And before you can do that, you kind of got to come around to their way of thinking or really understand it. And not just like what passes for thoughts, not what passes for thought in the minds of these people you think are idiots, but how they actually look at the world and why it makes sense to them. And once you really get that, it's much easier from that standpoint to then bring them around to something that's more like the way you look at things.
One of the things that seems important
Now, a piece here that I notice is different, especially from the Vervaekian ways of looking at things. From the Vervaekian perspective, as I understand it, is you are following the reason wherever it takes you. And if we think back to what Agnes Callard says, it's division of epistemic labor, right? So if we bring that in here he seems to be talking about it more from the perspective of a sophist, of someone who's trying to use rhetorical skill to get someone over to your position. And you do that by understanding their position as well as possible so that you can then present your position to them in such a way that is most appealing to them. That's different from a Socratic method where the questioner themselves is open to the possibility of their understanding being warped. They're only allowing themselves to be changed so far as to be able to be compelling to the other person. It's a kind of backward reasoning. And that seems to be different from the kind that Vervaekian and Agnes Callard are talking about. But let's continue.
in the Socratic method is a sort of humility about our own beliefs, and it seems that the approach of asking questions can be humble in a sense, because you're really trying to learn more about what the other person believes, even if your ultimate goal is that you suspect they're wrong and you want to change their mind. At the same time, there's sometimes the assumption that it's more persuasive to appear more confident in what you believe. So is there a balance that needs to be struck, or is it just not true that it's more persuasive to be confident?
Well, I suppose it's hard to generalize. I'm sure there are people who are very persuaded by confidence and not by humility. But the Socratic method, in any event, is founded on humility. I mean, I know the Socratic method sounds fundamentally like a technique for questioning other people and for trying to bring them around, and it's very powerful for that. But to me, first and foremost, it's a style of thought that if you really care about these things, you try to use yourself. So you're questioning what you think, and you're wondering if maybe you're wrong.
And I think that's an important piece to underscore. So I jumped the gun a bit. Here he addresses the issue I mentioned before.
And so when you're talking to people, you're trying to help questioning for them to see things your way, but you're also alert to the idea that maybe you have something to learn from them. And I think that one byproduct of that approach is that if you're humble in that way, you're more likely to make headway with others, but you're also more likely to make headway in seeing your own short-sightedness, which is, of course, something we should all want.
Can we talk through in practice how this might sort of appear if it's happening at, the Thanksgiving table is often the one people call in. They say, I know my uncle believes that. We could just stick with, my uncle believes Trump won. He just believes it was stolen. He believes Joe Biden stole it. And he's going to bring it up and he's going to say, can you guys believe what Joe Biden was able to get away with? And people want sort of a framework with which they can, without upsetting people, without ruining relationships, start a gentle Socratic inquiry. What types of questions might we ask in that situation?
Well, good question. I mean, the first question is, is it worthwhile at the Thanksgiving table to try to chase this down?
Let's assume it is. Let's assume it is.
I know,
to this person.
We'll assume it is, but I just mean you can be Socratic about the value of using these methods in any
Sure.
given moment. But putting that to one side.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, to me, the goal is always: can you find some common ground? Can you find something you agree on that you can then build from? So saying something like, look, here's what I'm interested in. What would you be willing to count as evidence that the election wasn't stolen, or what are you going to count as evidence of anything? I mean, let's just take something that's less controversial and just see if we can agree on that. How do you know that somebody else won the presidential election? Let's talk about an election we can agree on.
Right.
How do you know who won that election? I'm just interested. I mean, I'm really wondering how do you think about that? Because in the sense we don't know, all we know is what we read in the paper. So what makes you so sure that somebody you like that Donald Trump won the first election? And let them explain that for a while, and you say, okay, so that's interesting. So I guess what I'm wondering now is, of those things you mentioned, how many of those things are not also present in the election you are worried about? And so trying to find an election you can agree on before you start talking about an election you can't agree on, I think is a helpful approach. And I would just use that approach in general, is try to find a case you can agree on, and then talk through what that case is about, and then try to use what you've established in your easy case to sort of gently ask about the hard case.
That's really interesting. It seems there's maybe, in thinking about the empathy component there as well, there might be an opportunity also to find common ground in this conversation to say, are we on the same page that we both want whoever really won to be the president, right? Are we on the same page that's
Right.
that's ultimately what we want? We want to know who really won, but that person should definitely be the president. It seems that might also be useful.
Definitely, but then of course, so after, I think everybody would agree on that. That's a good thing to start with, and then you'd say, okay, now the question is, what does it mean to say somebody really won?
Yeah.
Like, do you mean somebody who got the most popular vote, or do you mean the person who won the electoral college? Forget about Trump for a minute. Just what do we mean in general? And you keep trying to build agreements on things. And once you have these agreements in place, you narrow everything down.
And keep that in mind. Agreements, narrowing things down. That's going to be relevant and pertinent. Again, I'm building it up.
I still think that, in these conversations, of course, you're always hopefully thinking, look, maybe I'll learn something. And you can say to the person honestly, let me tell you, if this election was stolen, I want to know. I mean, I don't want to live under a stolen election. I'm sure you don't either, David.
Right.
So if there's any evidence that this was stolen, I certainly would be grateful to hear about it. And I think you can say that. I think anybody can say that and mean it.
What about with one that can be, sometimes when the topic lends itself more to the ideas of experts and who counts as an expert, it can get much more dicey. So for example, we could think about COVID and vaccines, right? Where there's not only a disagreement about facts, there's a disagreement or misunderstanding about who is a valid authority and about the differences between facts and opinions. Oftentimes what are opinions are put out there as if it is the type of statement that counts as a fact, when really it's only an opinion. And it seems that it's a much tougher hill to climb, seemingly armed only with the Socratic method of questioning. How would the application be different in such circumstances?
Well, I don't think so, because I think you can still ask questions about other situations where people defer to experts. Like you might say, let's talk about are there any vaccines you do take? Well, why do you take those? Are there situations where expert opinions are enough for you? Because there are for me, and I think actually most of us defer to experts sometimes. And so the question is, when? And can you find a case where the answer is yes? And then what are the features of that case? And then how do the features of that case compare to the features of the case that's in controversy? I think that's the Socratic idea, is you always try to find something move over to an easier case where you can agree, and then establish some things you can agree on. Because usually what's going on is, in the controversial case, everybody's judgment is clouded by other features of it, by the politics of it, or the rooting interests that you have, almost like as a sports fan. And so you're trying to go find a case that is not clouded by those things, and establish your principles there, and then gently move them over into the case that's giving everybody more trouble.
What about specifically where sometimes the struggle will be when people will call me, I might present what I see as data and reports about a particular issue, and someone will say, well, my experience is just different. So it's an anecdote, right? We're talking about anecdotes versus empiricism. And it's very easy and reflexive to say that's an anecdote and we need to look at broader evidence. But people are often pretty resistant to that. They'll say, no, I mean, listen, this is what I experienced, and so this is real to me in some sense. What sort of advice do you have in that type of situation?
Well, I mean, I think first just listen to people. I mean, nobody's going to listen to you unless they feel like you listen to them. So if your immediate reaction is obvious contempt for their experience, then you're just not going to be off to an effective start. But let's imagine that you've done that. And I think at that point, maybe the most helpful way to reason is to ask, well, how do they feel when people make similar claims that are anecdotal or about their own experience, but who they don't agree with? I mean, because that's the kind of claim that people can't stand when it's made by those on the other side. So trying to think of an example, I mean, that's what I think in general is, if you can flip the politics in a situation, like imagine exactly what you're saying, but imagine somebody on the other side making that claim. You can ask somebody, what would you say to them? What would you think of the strength of that claim? I mean, I'm not trying to tell you how you'd feel, but how do you think you'd feel? And of course, it's always perfect if you can think of an actual example and say, well, what you're saying reminds me of somebody I knew and that you may have heard about, who actually made a very similar claim, but except that they love everything you hate. And I just wonder, how would you work with that person and say, well, that person's just wrong. Well, I know you think that, but they don't think that. So what would, I guess what you'd probably say to them is their ideas about what counts as evidence don't seem very strong. And then maybe you've got an inroad. I mean, these are hard. These are.
And give me just one moment. Yeah, so that was a little bit of that. It's starting to doze off at the end. Give me just one moment. I need to pause for a second. Okay, I am back. Here I am. Back again. Okay. Anything else? Socratic toolbox. Okay, let's watch a little bit more.
They're not conversations that you can expect, in which you can expect to turn somebody 180 degrees. The question is, can you make a little headway?
Yeah, it seems that although there is a sort of Socratic toolbox, that it's really more of a framework. Is that fair to say than a sort of how-to?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is. There is sort of a toolbox. There are a lot of techniques that Socrates uses, but it's also just a mindset and a stance of sort of humility and awareness of your own arrogance and ignorance. You're trying to learn from others in good faith. So I don't think it's a paint by numbers scheme for questioning, but if you do study the method in the book, the Socratic method that I've written tries to provide some sort of guidance on that. I think it provides you with an approach to hard conversations that can be more productive than just arguing with people directly and contradicting them.
Is there a connection beyond just what seems to be superficially a little bit of overlap between Socrates and Stoicism?
Well, I would say so. The Stoics regard, and when you talk about Stoicism, of course, you're talking about the philosophy. The word Stoicism in trace back to things Socrates said.
If we go back to that era and we think about the trial and execution of Socrates, does that tell us something about just the general distaste many have to have their
Okay, I think that's enough of that. Okay, where do we go from here? I'm gonna just pop that puppy off, and we are going to take a look at the next thing on the list. But I hope that was able to give you some ideas from a guy. I recommend that book. There's a lot of decent information on that. I think there was someone else I wanted to check out. So I like to watch this guy because he's a philosopher, more on the religious side of things. He's got a decent amount of lectures that were interesting for me to watch, and it would be interesting to just take a look at his perspective, considering the majority of philosophers tend to be atheists. So sometimes it's good to get just a different perspective. I am agnostic. I think in terms of the religious thing, I'm pretty agnostic, squarely middling. So here's this guy. I'm gonna let him talk to a bit. I haven't watched this video, so we may stop early because I want to get to the other piece. But I just wanted to get a little bit about his perspective. Go ahead. Hold on. Have you all not been able to hear? That's not good.
Bond. Well, Socrates.
Wow. Okay. So you weren't able to hear what I had just done because I had turned that off. Well, that's stupid. But sorry, just technical difficulties. But you heard me up to this point. And I think you've heard the most of things up until I was futzing around with my OBS. So, good enough. We're going to watch this guy and listen to what he has to say.
Socrates himself didn't quite do it that way. Instead, he tended to address prominent citizens of Athens, as well as students, and ask them questions. They would be asking about usually a practical question. Almost all of the early dialogues depicting Socrates start with a practical question, something like, how should we educate our children, so that they grow up not only being successful and knowledgeable, but also wise, and moreover virtuous. We want them to be good people. And so he will say, well, before we inquire into how to educate somebody, we have to understand what that goal is. So, what is virtue? What is courage? What is it to be successful? What is friendship? What is love? What is justice? Later, Socrates starts asking more abstract questions, such as what is knowledge? What is truth? And so forth. Now, the point here is always that he's looking for a definition. He starts out dealing with a practical problem. And I think that's meant to stress that philosophy is a practical discipline. It's meant to address questions like how to educate your children, how to pursue your own life, how to do various things and what you ought to be doing. But then he says, look, to understand that, we have to know what our goal is. So we have to know what virtue is. We have to know what justice is. We have to know what knowledge is, and so on. And the crucial question is, in order to know, we have to be able to define these things. In his dialogue, The Laches, which is about courage, he says, and surely what we know we must be able to tell. That, I think, is a crucial assumption for Socrates. What we know we must be able to tell. Now, it's not so clear that Plato himself endorses this view. Maybe there are all sorts of things that we can know without being able to define them, without being able to tell what we know. And here I don't just mean knowing.
So here I hear the invocation of Vervaeke's four ways of knowing again. So once again, that's propositional, perspectival, procedural, and participatory. Four different things we can know.
How to do something.
Procedural.
You might know how to ride a bicycle, for example, without being able to explain to anyone how to do it. But I mean knowing that. Knowing, well, gosh, what exactly is involved in knowing what justice is? If we're thinking about how to educate our children to be virtuous, for example, well, we have to understand the goal. What is it we're trying to attain?
And I'm going to just pause it there because I am starting to get a little sleepy. So I've got to keep it a little interesting for myself here. I just pop that off. Okay, so what have we learned so far? Well, we've learned that Vervaeke, at least according to Vervaeke, Socrates is the depth of what Socrates is trying to get at is more than I think how a lot of people are rendering this method. And I think that speaks to Vervaeke's own relationship to this material, and that it is very deeply meaningful to him, and so he presents it very deeply and meaningfully rather than just some sort of thought game, which is something to consider. Now we learn from Agnes Callard that the Socratic method is a way of distributing epistemic knowledge. So like she brought up William James responding to, I forget who the other guy is, and how we can either like avoid falsehoods or assert truths, and that by having both of those people in dialogue, we can establish epistemic truths by having two people fight for it. This is what Vervaeke would more mystically call dialogos, when that's going well, when it's getting into a flow state. Okay, so then what else did we learn? We learned a little bit from Carneades about the Socratic method in terms of what it's doing. We learned a little bit from Ward Farnsworth about the book in terms of like suspending judgment as being a part of it, being open to ourselves being wrong. I mean, that's I think has to be a theme, more than just the refutation of the propositions. And notice there's certain ways of being that you have to adopt in order to be Socratic. You have to get rid of the perhaps your own biases even. If you are going to change and properly ask Socratic questions, you yourself have to let go perhaps of even your own notions of the things that you know, and that's demanding of you as the practitioner. So I want to move now to Nolanda debate. Now what would be interesting for me to do in this stream would also be to eventually get to what's it called? Street epistemology, which is a way of it's another kind of way of doing Socratic debate. And it would be interesting to sort of talk about these things together. And I haven't done a street epistemology. It's something that has been interesting to me. And maybe we can do some videos on that. I don't think I can get to that today. But what we are going to do is finally get to Nolanda debate. Now, what is Nolanda debate? I'm going to pull up what they say they are. And we're going to just read through it. Now, from what I can understand, is what I'm inferring based on a couple things from the website is basically when COVID happened, the Dalai Lama was like, people are going crazy with not knowing how to know things. So here's this tool we pulled from the Buddhist toolkit. Let's offer it to people. Let's teach it to people. And maybe that can function as some kind of a thing they can use to discern truths from falsities, right? So that's as best as I can tell from the knowledge. Now I'll show you why I think that. I'm just going to pop that up and shrink this puppy down a bit. Okay, so first I want to show you this quote. It says, "One unique thing about the Nolanda tradition is that we extensively use a logical approach. Single-pointed meditation is good, but it is even better to do analytical meditation and engage in discussions, debate." That was from the Dalai Lama in December of 2020. That's at the end of the first year of the COVID-19 virus. So my sense was at that time he was like, people need a tool to develop truth, and he's offering the Buddhist method. Now if we scroll up what we read on this website, so this is debateschool.org, what we see is, so why learn Nolanda debate? In an era where new knowledge is produced by unprecedented unprecedented rates, and at every stage of its production is challenged by misinformation, skills of critical analysis have never been more valuable. Nolanda debate provides a formal structure for you to engage in constructive dialogues, whether in the classroom, research lab, or daily life. It brings extra clarity as you investigate the many aspects of our world. Okay. Utilized, I'll just keep reading here, utilized by Tibetan scholar contemplatives for the past 1,000 years to investigate the function of cognition and perception and to ultimately probe the very nature of reality. The Nolanda debate is a tried and true method of enhancing our critical thinking capacities. The unique style of using consequential reasoning, pointing out absurd logical consequences in a partner's stated view, reductio ad absurdum reasoning, helps to reveal hidden cognitive biases and unacknowledged contradictions held within one's mind. By situating a dialogue in a restrictive format, the discussion can progress and unearth richer and richer meaning without getting sidetracked or falling prey to time-wasting strawmen and ad hominem arguments. While useful for anyone who intends to be an active citizen of a knowledge-based society, this tool is especially pertinent for today's research scientists. The practice of Nolanda debate depends on some logical rules shared in common across most systems of knowledge, but does not assume any knowledge or acceptance of specifically Buddhist views. Now, my experience actually with this format is that it is actually very Socratic in a somewhat refined way. Not saying that it's better than the Socratic style, but it is very Socratic in style in terms of what its function is. Now here's what I want to do is first I want to describe what it entails, and then we'll watch a little video about what it looks like to actually do it. So basically there are three parts to the structure. So perhaps we can start with your standard syllogism. And sometimes I describe a syllogism as a unit of philosophy. That's not technically true, and that's really my own personal definition. But basically, a syllogism is something like the phrase, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That comes in the format of premise, conclusion. So in that format, the first premise is all men are mortal. The second premise is Socrates is a man. And then the conclusion is Socrates, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, additionally, how it's done in the Nolanda debate, instead of premise, conclusion, it's subject, predicate, and reason. Those are the three parts. And there's moves you can make in between some of the parts because it's a debate format. It's not a syllogism, though it's built around the syllogism. So the first two parts, the subject and the predicate, would be something like, if we were to use the Socratic one, it would be like, and it would start with take the subject, Socrates. Let me just think about this real quick. Take the subject, Socrates is a man. That would be the subject part. Take the subject, Socrates is a man. That's subject. Predicate begins with the words it follows. So the subject starts with take the subject, colon, take the subject. The predicate begins with it follows that, or it follows. So take the subject, Socrates is a man. It follows that he is mortal. At this juncture, it's a debate, right? So in the debate, I need to back up a bit. So in the debate, there is a challenger and there is a defender. The challenger is the one who's proposing these ideas. So the challenger would say, take the subject, Socrates is a man. That's the subject. The predicate is, it follows that Socrates is mortal. Those two put together are called the thesis. So the thesis in its entirety is take the subject, Socrates is a man. It follows that Socrates is mortal. That's the thesis. Once again, that's take the subject, Socrates is a man. It follows that Socrates is mortal. That's the thesis statement. Okay, so at this juncture, the defender has the opportunity to make two choices. They can either accept that, or they can ask why. And within the reason why, they are implicitly negating the thesis. They are saying, no, it's wrong. I hear a lot of people have the urge to say, well, not necessarily regarding certain things, but it's an implicit no, and that prevents you from falling on one side or the other. This is, as I understand it, with the two sessions I had last weekend at the debate school. So if you were to ask why, then the challenger would be compelled to give a reason why. That reason would be, oh, there goes my camera. Wow. And we bring it back. I don't know why it's been doing that lately. It's kind of annoying. I didn't used to do that. Okay, so they would ask for a reason, and I would give the reason because all men are mortal. At which point, the defender has another choice, opportunity to make choices. They have three choices they can make there. They can say, I accept. So that would mean they accept the thesis, all men are mortal. Take the subject, Socrates is a man. It follows that Socrates is mortal. Why? Because all men are mortal. I accept. That would be the defender's option. I accept. There's two other choices. One is they can say the reason is not true, which would basically mean, well, all men aren't mortal. Let's assume that there's one person who is immortal of mankind, at which point you would say the reason is not true. Not all men are mortal. It doesn't necessarily follow that Socrates is mortal because Socrates is a man, because we have at least one example of an immortal man, and that very well could be Socrates. So that would be the reason is not true. The other term is basically means it doesn't necessarily the reason does not entail the predicate. So Socrates is So if we go take the subject Socrates is a man, it follows that Socrates is mortal. The predicate is it follows that Socrates is mortal. It follows that Socrates is mortal, right? It follows that Socrates is mortal. Suppose to that you were to say why, respond with why, and I said because Socrates is a duck. That doesn't make any sense. You could say the reason is not true there, but suppose this is where I start to lose it a bit, because I feel like the reason is not true, but it would need to be that would need to be drawn out a bit more. I mean, that doesn't really make sense, right? Socrates is mortal because Socrates is a duck. Oof, that's not good. I think my camera is failing. We don't like it when our camera fails, huh? Okay. This is no bueno. It's rough. Anyway, basically the other idea is you would say no pervasion, which is it doesn't necessarily follow. Basically, so Socrates is immortal because Socrates is the duck. Basically just means that doesn't really make any sense. I feel like at that point you could say no pervasion. Now, I may be getting that wrong. I think you could also say the reason is not true. Once again, I've only had the 2 sessions, but this is as I sort of understand it now, as I've got it so far. So, those all pretty boring to talk about, I think, to say. But what we can do now is we can watch some of a clip to see how it is done. Now, I can't watch this whole thing right now, but we can watch a little bit of it and get an idea. This guy actually teaches. The guy on the right actually is a teacher for the class. And we're going to watch some of this and see what it's like. And then I'm sadly going to have to leave by virtue of the fact that I have other stuff to do. So, oh man, okay. Let's do it.
Basically is this. You say first the
We're gonna go.
the art of Nolanda debate. Are you ready?
Yes, ready.
Okay, ready. Good. So when we are debating, we have various kinds of questions, really 2 main kinds of questions. And the first kind of question is called a pervasion question. Or you could call it a statement of pervasion because it's phrased as a declarative statement, even though the answer comes in either affirming or negating. You either affirm or you deny it. So it's like a yes or no question when it comes down to the meaning. So the phrasing of it basically is this. You say first the word it follows, and then an if-then statement. So it follows that if it is A, then it's necessarily B. So what could we make a statement like the color of grass? So we have grass and plants around here. So the color of grass follows that if it's the color of grass, then it's necessarily green. Then you clap. That marks the end of your question. So that's a question, really, right? It's phrased as a declarative statement, but it's saying, what do you think it means? It follows that if it's the color of grass, then it's necessarily green. Would you accept that, or do you think that's true or not true?
I accept that.
You accept that. Okay, so if you accept that, then exactly like you said, just say I accept.
I accept.
Okay. Now, if you were to deny it, then you could say instead of I accept, you could say why. Okay, so what if I ask you something like it follows that if it is a tree, then it's necessarily a magnolia tree.
Why?
Why? Right. So those are the two answers that you are allowed to give in the Nolanda debate after asking this kind of pervasion question. Why or I accept. Now, we'll get back to the I accept in a moment, but when you said why to the second question, then it means that when you look at all the different types of trees that exist in the universe, anything you've ever learned about or know about, then you should be able to find one, at least one, which is something that is a tree but is not a magnolia tree. So since you said why, now I can ask you, give an example. So give an example of something which is a tree but is not a magnolia tree.
Jasmine.
A jasmine tree. Okay. So you say jasmine tree. Now I'm going to come back and now I'm going to make the second kind of question. So we'll double check to make sure that you really are confident in your answer there. So the second kind of question is called a thesis question. Now, again, it's phrased as just a declarative statement, but since when you're answering, you have to answer it like a yes or no question, we can call it a question. So it goes like this. Take the subject, the jasmine tree, it follows that, it is a tree.
I accept.
Good, so exactly right. You say I accept again. So those are, again, just the same two answers here that you can give. So now a pervasion question and a thesis question, even though the questions are worded differently, the answers are the same. You either say I accept or why. So what happened here? We took a thesis. That means it's a combination of a subject and a predicate. The subject was jasmine, a jasmine tree. The predicate was a tree. So take the subject, the jasmine tree. It follows that it's a tree. Okay. You accept. So now, when you gave that as an example of something which is a tree but not a magnolia tree, so the first part, the fact that it's a tree, we're double checking.
Okay. I don't think it's necessarily interesting to watch this whole thing, so I'm actually going to just pause it there. But and it sounds like I actually got something wrong in my initial description. It seems like thesis question is something that strictly entails something from the subject into the predicate, as I understand it. Anyway, once again, still learning this skill. The primary thing I wanted to highlight here is if we consider everything we've learned so far about the Socratic method, which entails a kind of questioning that leads the person into their own contradictions, and which how dealing with those contradictions leads to changing how we change as a being, as an entity, and how that forces us to expand into to what is more real. This gives us a better understanding of reality itself. So if we take something like Nolanda debate, where if we think back to what Agnes Callard said about the distribution of epistemic labor, you have a similar thing going on here with a subject or with a challenger and a defender. And it can be applied, I think, in a similar way. Now, the thing with this style of debate, the thing that I think is absent from it, and why I made that little pit stop to aporia, is that I don't know that this style of debate really evokes the sense of aporia. But then again, I don't think that the Socratic method, as it's typically utilized in philosophy school, like departments and the law, is used in that way either. Not that aporia can't emerge, but I think part of the Socratic method is in some way seeking aporia. So here we have a situation in this style of debate, from my experience of it, is it is fun to try and set up as a challenger ways a statement that sounds preposterous, and then try and get the defender to squirm around until they accept what was initially a preposterous statement. And there is an element of competition in that, and just because you are able to maneuver intellectually around someone such that they then have to accept that they have made an apparent contradiction, that doesn't necessarily mean that that they've made or that they have that the claim is true or that it is false. What it really probably means is more something like chess. Like in chess, you may make a wrong move or a good move and not understand why it's a blunder or why it is a good move. But in chess is often derived from heuristics. So it may be the case that Nolanda debate teaches sort of heuristics of reasoning more than it actually does, more than it actually facilitates a kind of aporia that forces oneself to change. Now that isn't to say that it doesn't, but at least as it's being presented in this this debate school, it's presented more as kind of an epistemic tool for like determining how we know a thing, asking for a reason, determining whether that reason is good, engaging in how the contradictions in our own thinking may not lead us, or not being aware of contradictions in our own thinking. I think it might also fall prey to a kind of some elements of what's the word? When you're using a word in a different way than it's intended. But the good thing about the debate is if there is a mistake in understanding what definition a person is using, you can sort of weave that out through the debate itself. Or there's another part of the debate called a counting debate, where you basically define your terms ahead of time before you get into the debate part itself, what they call a logic debate. So there's the counting debate where you define terms, and then the logic debate where you work through the what necessarily follows from the terms you've established. Anyway, I think that's where I'm going to leave it. I don't know that this was, I hope that this has been informative and interesting. When I come back next time, what I'd like to do is I'd like to expand on this a bit. I'll probably come back with reports of my experience. Well, actually, I can do my report on what I experienced. I can give a quick relay of what it was like. So we use GatherTown, which is an application that's kind of looks like Pokemon or like old school, role-playing, like digital role-playing games. So you got a little character that walks around, which actually is kind of fun. That makes it kind of fun, and you when you go next to people, their screens pop up and you can see them, and that's kind of fun. So that's been a kind of fun experience. There's usually a little bit of a lecture, but then they kind of want to get you into it. They start you off pretty slowly. They give you some worksheets to follow that get you used to the just saying what it is you need to say correctly in the right format before it's kind of like training wheels before you learn to balance yourself and start to do BMX tricks, right? They give you kind of training wheels of things that you can say and just get you in the habit of the way that it's presented. So it starts with a little bit of a lecture, following which we go outside of the temple and then we find someone to debate with, and we go through the exercises on the worksheet. You know, and each worksheet sort of emphasizes a different thing to sort of get used to like what's going on. So you might emphasize giving reasons for things, or like working on, you know, like they'll have the reasons, and you get used to like what pervasion means, which I'm still sort of grasping. And then they normally have a Q&A, and then you leave, and then you come back a few hours later to do it again. And it's really early in the morning from where I am, which is exhausting, but it's fun. It's fun. I've met some people doing some similar things. It's people from all over the world, a bunch of different, what do you call it? Monks and nuns are also there as well, taking the class. So it's kind of a fun little joint, kind of a fun little thing. And it'll be interesting to attend the next session, which will be this weekend. So the next time I stream, I don't know if that's going to be this week. If it is this week, then obviously I won't talk about the follow-up. If it isn't and I'll just focus on, I want to explore this style of debate a bit more, like watch a few more informational videos about it, maybe play a little bit more with the after Socrates stuff, play a little bit more about with street epistemology, and exploring that as like a tool, because it's kind of a different spin on a similar thing. It's more about taking a specific belief and determining the robustness of it, which is kind of what this is about. But you start with something you believe in, and you go from there. And it uses sort of a different set of tools. So it'd be cool to examine that as well. It'd be cool to go through some debates and look at that. But it would also be cool to examine some things related to like authentic relating, the other pieces of the Vervaeke puzzle that involve multiple people dialoguing, circling, circling, authentic relating, etc. And I had this sort of joke in my head that circling authentic relating can sort of be squarely put in the box of things white people like, and it's kind of true. But it would also be kind of cool to explore certain styles from like hip hop, like the idea of the hip hop cipher, or like topics, where someone gives you a topic and you try to come up with a way of rapping about it, which is incorporating things like rhythm and timing, while also paying attention to the outside world. And I feel like there's that piece that hasn't really been covered by Vervaeke and his work, and it would be cool to explore some of that as non-gringo-y as possible, as non-whitely as possible. But anyway, I'm tired. I'm gonna go and eat some dinner, and from there, be back at some point. And for anyone who watches this, thanks for tuning in. Might chop it up, make a video, don't know. But otherwise, peace out, peoples. We'll see you next time. Adios.